It was a precision operational Tuesday morning, precisely subsequent to 07:09 hours. The air still secured that hyper-cold, honeysuckle-sweet stillness of early spring, and the scent of wild grass traversed the open kitchen window while I was fortifying my black coffee. I had just deployed sustenance to the chickens. The dog was executing operational downtime, and for a secondary moment, existence on the absolute perimeter of the neighborhood registered precisely as I had demanded it to register. Quiet, unbothered, non-negotiably mine. That status achieved immediate change the moment the ground initiated seismic activity. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. The seismic event was quickly superseded by the heavy, destructive crunch of tires on gravel, excessive in mass to be a standard delivery unit. I executed departure onto my porch, deploying operational boots and a bathrobe, and visually acquired them. 2 HOA utility trucks, a rented flatbed, and, most incredibly, a full-sized geological drilling rig being guided up my gravel road by 3 high-visibility orange-vested contractors. They were deploying directly into my property, traversing the cut cattle gate I had strategically failed to secure. They failed to initiate inquiry or reduce velocity. And before I could achieve thermal stabilization of my coffee, one of them was uncoiling industrial cable near my barn, as if the asset was irrevocably owned by their command structure. "What precise failure are you executing?" I commanded. The youngest contractor, sweat already achieving saturation through his vest, offered the bureaucratic excuse. "Water survey, sir. We possess authorization from the HOA board." "This is private, sovereign property," I countered sharply. "I failed to authorize a single operational action." He executed a dismissive shrug. "Engage the board. We are merely contractors." I stormed down the steps and demanded operational paperwork. I was presented with a malicious memo from the Oak Summit HOA, fraudulently asserting they were initiating a water table survey and citing a handwritten line. "Includes undeveloped border parcels within emergency easement allowance." I failed to require supplementary data. My land was non-negotiably external to Oak Summit. I possessed an original land deed from the 1940s, secured when this entire valley was merely scrub and cattle trails. The HOA had executed a criminal, unilateral expansion of their operational reach. The drill initiated functional deployment an hour later, boring straight into soil that had never once belonged to their command structure. I processed the absolute operational error instantly. The board had failed to initiate contact because they knew the action was criminal. Around 1,000 hours, I achieved contact with Nancy Tilman, their new environmental liaison. She responded with the tinny, aggressively indifferent vocal output of a bureaucrat I used to engage in combat with during my service deployment. "I am unable to process the source of your distress, Mr. McCrae. We possess the legal right under emergency environmental access provisions. Perhaps execute a check of your spam folder." I terminated the connection immediately. I retrieved my USACE technical documentation and initiated 2 critical calls, one to the county land office for document fraud and one to Jack Perkins, state infrastructure contact, commanding him to transmit the coordinates. I will execute analysis of the water rights overlay. By noon, the drill was 30 feet down, and the crew chief deployed a final warning. "You might desire to execute movement of your livestock, sir. We will be deploying pressure testing tomorrow." "Execute immediate departure from my land," I commanded. That night, I discovered the inevitable. The air possessed a different, corrosive scent, acrid, like boiled eggs and compromised metal. The subsequent morning, I visually acquired it, the thin yellow sheen creeping like sickness from the borehole. The sulfur had achieved elevation, and zero segment of their command structure possessed cognitive comprehension of the environmental weapon they had just unleashed. The silence was absolute. Zero bird song, no rustling leaves, merely the distant hum of generators and a new, deeper category of wrong vibrating from beneath my feet. They had punched through the earth and unlocked a subterranean infection. The hostile occupation of my land and the immediate, arrogant dismissal by Nancy Tilman did not register as a standard property dispute. It initiated a Tier 2 environmental threat in my mind. This precise classification was not based on instinct. It was based on 26 years of non-negotiable experience with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, USACE. I did not merely retire from a job. I disengaged from a high-stakes career specializing in hydrogeological impact studies, infrastructure drilling protocols, and post-disaster mitigation. I had personally overseen the cleanup operations in 3 post-flood zones and reviewed more geotechnical reports than these suburban tyrants had ever seen in their collective, entitled lives. My quiet life on the edge of the neighborhood was a chosen sanctuary, but my expertise was a dormant weapon. The moment they breached my fence and punched a hole into the earth, they activated a strategic command structure dedicated to their annihilation. I immediately accessed the physical evidence of my authority. The heavy gray file box marked USACE retired, untouched for over a decade. Inside lay my federal certifications, clearance letters, and the binder labeled Hydrogeological Impact Protocols, Tier 2 Threat Classifications. I specifically referenced the section detailing sulfur intrusion, the malignant force they had just unleashed. What the HOA had done, drilling into a subsurface sulfur deposit without proper mitigation plans, geological surveys, or containment structures, was not merely reckless, it was environmental negligence bordering on criminal endangerment. I possessed absolute technical certainty that every sign I witnessed, the acrid scent, the yellow sheen, the structural failure of the soil, matched the contamination profiles listed in EPA and federal documents. This knowledge allowed me to build a case that bypassed local pettiness and went directly to state and federal jurisdiction. The second morning of the trespass delivered the undeniable physical proof that my technical assessment was correct. The air was no longer merely acrid. It was toxic, saturated with the stench of hydrogen sulfide, H2S, the kind of smell that seizes your sinuses and refuses to liquidate its grip, registering like a cracked, festering, rotten egg. The drill had achieved supplementary depth overnight, and the ground around the borehole was actively oozing a milky, corrosive yellowish froth with spectral ribbons of steam rising into the polluted air. Yet the crew, deploying full respirators now, continued to execute operational deployment, treating the biohazard weapon they had uncorked as a minimal inconvenience. I visually acquired the juvenile contractor, red-eyed and coughing, scooping the toxic runoff into a black container, deploying a hazmat label, a final, damning piece of evidence that they possessed knowledge of the danger but prioritized operational completion over safety. I immediately deployed my authority. I traversed the pasture, ignoring the criminal sight of the sawed-through lock and the discarded bolt cutters, physical proof of felony criminal trespass, and confronted the foreman. He attempted to deploy the standard bureaucratic defense, citing the Oak Summit HOA Environmental Committee and regional drought mitigation. I terminated his narrative with the non-negotiable truth. I possess a deed and a county map confirming this data. You criminally liquidated my gate. You drilled without permit. You are extracting sulfur runoff without containment. Do you possess cognitive comprehension of the specific contaminant you impacted? His hesitation and subsequent retreat after I initiated phone recording confirmed the lack of legal cover. They were operating in the tactical shadows of authority, bluffing with fractured truths. To build the case for annihilation, I executed a forensic protocol. I secured 3 containment jars of groundwater, one from the immediate bore site runoff, one from my old well, to establish infiltration, and one from the creek bordering both properties, to prove regional contamination. I meticulously labeled each jar, deploying absolute chain of custody protocol, knowing these samples were the final scientific evidence required to escalate the situation beyond local law enforcement. The visual discrepancy was already devastating. The bore site sample registered as if someone had poured lemonade into a puddle of acid. This critical evidence was immediately deployed to my high-level assets. I transmitted the full operational data, including the video footage of the criminal trespass and the hazmat runoff, to Jack Perkins, my state infrastructure contact. Jack's response was definitive. He would deploy a state operative to execute a discrete analysis and secure a Tier 2 environmental breach filing. Simultaneously, I reached out to Dr. Emily Harrow, a former top analyst in Colorado's Division of Water Resources, who agreed to deploy a state DWR field tech to extract a soil core sample from my property. A superior, official, scientific maneuver contrasting sharply with the HOA's crude drilling. The arrival of the plain white DWR truck with Colorado state plates was the silent physical symbol that federal-level expertise was now deployed against the local HOA's arrogance. The contamination, however, was already achieving systemic failure. The HOA's manicured tree line, their prize-winning sugar maples and ornamental ash, were initiating browning at the tips, and the dogwood had already executed structural collapse onto a neighbor's yard, its roots black, waterlogged, and coated in sulfur slime. Nancy Tilman's immediate counter-narrative, a newsletter labeling the destruction seasonal stress and commanding residents to reduce water deployment, was a malicious, compounding lie that I immediately highlighted and secured as further evidence of fraud. My neighbor, James, provided the necessary human validation, confirming the HOA's lie and detailing the effect of the acrid fumes on his nauseous daughter, elevating the stakes from property damage to community health endangerment. I was no longer fighting for mere land. I was fighting to prove they'd trespassed, poisoned, and committed absolute, documented fraud against the entire community. The evidence was irrefutable, and the state-level operational deployment was secured. The confirmation of severe environmental contamination and the legal deployment of state authority failed to induce Nancy Tilman and the Oak Summit HOA board into ethical compliance. Instead, they activated a highly sophisticated, multi-layered cover-up protocol designed to silence dissent and destroy the evidence of their negligence. Their initial response to my legal action and the public visibility of the dying trees was not apology or containment. It was a brazen attempt to rewrite the operational narrative and erase my existence from the story. They immediately flooded the Oak Summit listserv with a series of vague, saccharine community wellness updates, subject-lined with malicious cheer, addressing concerns, tree health and spring transitions, all designed to deploy a digital smile concealing a knife. The core message was a malicious lie. The dead trees were fraudulently blamed on seasonal fungus, and the toxic sulfur stench was dismissed as a temporary soil imbalance. The drilling, they claimed, was merely a minor hydrological survey within the HOA, perimeter in collaboration with county environmental advisors. A complete, documented fabrication. This narrative warfare was coupled with direct, targeted attempts to isolate and annihilate my credibility. Their official correspondence contained specific language warning residents. Please do not engage with misinformation being circulated through unofficial channels or from parties not recognized as members of the HOA community. This move was a deliberate, cynical effort to frame me, the only operative with the irrefutable technical data, as a fringe element, a bitter outsider attempting to stir the pot and jeopardize the neighborhood's prestige. They calculated that social shaming and bureaucratic exclusion would be more effective than legal counter-defense. I recognized this tactic immediately from my time in service. It was the bureaucratic maneuver of gaslighting, an attempt to manipulate the community's perception of reality to protect their own malignant power structure. The digital cover-up was immediately supported by physical suppression of evidence. I visually confirmed this conspiracy when Nancy Tilman, still deploying her trademark white blouse and pearl necklace, executed a door-to-door deployment, not to address the biohazard, but to manage the political fallout. She forced neighbors like James to sign a community solidarity pledge, an insidious document agreeing not to engage with or spread any unsubstantiated claims about the drilling or the vegetation loss. Simultaneously, the HOA maintenance budget was weaponized. Landscaping crews were deployed across the HOA lawns, executing a frantic, sloppy remediation, ripping out dead hedges and trees, digging up the poisoned earth, and then attempting to conceal the evidence by deploying new topsoil and decorative mulch over the rot beneath. This was not remediation. This was a full-scale criminal attempt to sanitize a crime scene, a frantic effort to hide the environmental breach before the inevitable arrival of the state agencies. In some areas, they merely chopped down the sick trees and abandoned the stumps, covering them with a thin, fraudulent layer of lies designed to deceive the visually compromised residents. My technical discovery was the only asset capable of neutralizing this massive deception. I immediately forwarded the lab reports and the video footage, the evidence of the sulfur sludge and the criminal trespass, to my assets, Jack Perkins and Paul Sanderson, the land use attorney. Jack's confirmation that the Department of Natural Resources, DNR, was now formally reviewing the incident under a Tier 2 environmental breach protocol was the necessary authority beat. This was followed by the ultimate legal escalation: the delivery of a formal notice of nuisance to my home, hand-delivered by a juvenile in an HOA golf cart. The notice maliciously accused me of interfering with HOA operations, harassing contractors, and spreading inflammatory claims that damaged community trust. This document, a pathetic final piece of pre-litigation intimidation, was immediately deployed to Paul, who confirmed its status as classic pre-litigation intimidation, and initiated the drafting of the civil complaint that would follow every single conspirator into court. The conspiracy was then breached by my network. Denise, an operative on the landscaping committee, achieved contact, confirming the HOA's internal panic. She revealed that when she questioned the unauthorized, aggressive removal of trees from residents' yards, they stated it was necessary remediation, failing to secure homeowner consent. Her final critical intel: Nancy Tilman and the board were internally circulating data that talking would jeopardize property values, utilizing financial terror to secure silence. This confirmed their primary motive was asset protection through fraud, not environmental safety. This intelligence, combined with the soil analysis report, H2S concentration 8.3 ng/co, pH 3.9, which proved they punctured an unstable, volatile sulfuric layer, allowed me to execute the final weaponization of data. I compiled the war report, a dossier containing every lie, every time-stamped video, every dead tree, and the full DWR lab analysis. I then executed the video weaponization protocol. I uploaded a second video, focusing entirely on the scientific data and the irrefutable DWR conclusions, narrating it with the kind of gravitas that required no anger, only truth. I ended the video with a single, lethal sentence. Warning: this isn't just about trees, it's about trust, land, and the consequences of unchecked authority. The video achieved 100,000 views by morning and, critically, secured a formal subpoena from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, CDPHE. This subpoena, a demand for all documentation, permits, and internal correspondence, was the absolute, non-negotiable proof that the state had formally joined the resistance. The HOA's attempt to gaslight me into silence had, instead, lit a fire they could not contain. The technical discovery phase achieved its absolute zenith with the delivery of the formal subpoena from the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment, CDPHE. This was the moment the conflict ceased to be a mere property dispute. It was now a state-mandated inquiry into unauthorized environmental disturbance and potential criminal trespass. The subpoena was not a suggestion. It was a command for all critical intelligence, internal correspondence, permits, contractor agreements, and the non-existent environmental impact assessments from the HOA board. The virality of my second video, which deployed the unassailable DWR soil analysis, had successfully forced the government's hand, proving that truth, disseminated aggressively, is the ultimate bureaucratic weapon. While the HOA continued their frantic, localized cover-up, deploying crews in masks and spreading lies about seasonal stress, the real story was now locked into the state's legal infrastructure. The physical manifestation of this authority arrived in an unprecedented investigative convoy. I observed their deployment from my porch. 3 white SUVs bearing the seal of the CDPHE, a dedicated truck from the Department of Natural Resources, DNR, and a final marked vehicle from the County Environmental Enforcement Division. This was not a friendly visit. It was a show of absolute state authority, deployed to build a non-negotiable legal case. I met the lead operative, Agent Moreno, at the fence line, a tall woman deploying a navy field jacket and mirrored sunglasses, utterly impervious to the HOA's public relations fog. She presented a warrant and a sealed directive authorizing full access to the entire drilling site, encompassing both my sovereign land and the HOA's perimeter. I immediately presented her with the signed affidavit from Paul Sanderson, my attorney, detailing the criminal trespass, the cut fence, and the absence of any permission for entry onto my land. The investigative deployment on my property was forensic and relentless. Hazmat suits were deployed, soil core drills were activated, and chemical testing kits secured immediate samples. They brought in a portable water analyzer and spent the entire day meticulously documenting the contamination. 2 officers deployed GPS equipment to map the precise coordinates where the HOA's contractors had operated, creating an unassailable geographical timeline of the crime. Every few minutes, an operative secured another photograph of a decayed root, a discolored lawn, or a gaping hole where a magnificent tree once stood, evidence accumulating in high-volume, irrefutable data sets. By the time the sun initiated descent, they had secured sufficient evidence to fully occupy 2 cargo vans. Agent Moreno's debriefing confirmed the strategic success of the operation. She verified that the HOA's hired contractors had failed to register their equipment with the county, possessed 0 permit applications, and failed to secure insurance waivers for excavation beyond regulated depth. Her final summary was devastatingly simple. As far as the state's concerned, this was an illegal operation. You may want to prepare for court. I confirmed that preparations were already in motion. Paul Sanderson had been strategically preparing the civil suit, utilizing every piece of technical data we had secured: trespass, property damage, unlawful excavation, environmental negligence, and malicious misrepresentation. He elevated the legal threat further by finding grounds for a claim under the Colorado Open Lands Protection Act, which specifically prohibits private developments from disturbing subsurface geological formations on land they do not own without explicit oversight. The potential penalties were now calculated in 6 figures minimum, ensuring the HOA possessed no financial route for escape. Simultaneously, the Pipewind Community Alliance initiated its final internal mobilization. The virality of the videos and the official state investigation had broken the community's fear. Neighbors who had previously ignored me now achieved contact, quietly and humbly. Denise, James, and Barbara formalized the resistance, creating the Oak Summit Restoration Committee. Barbara immediately executed a mission to secure testimonies from sick residents. James mapped out every affected area, and Denise coordinated the legal updates. They were no longer scattered victims. They were a unified coalition of resistance, proving that the Forge of Truth had created a community where Nancy Tilman's fabricated hierarchy had only created fear. The HOA, realizing the total failure of their cover-up and the irreversible deployment of state authority, attempted a final, desperate maneuver. They tried to hold a closed, unrecorded board meeting to salvage their operational structure. However, the internal loyalty had completely dissolved. Someone leaked the audio of the meeting, capturing Nancy Tilman lamenting, "We just need to keep the optics clean until the next election." This quote, a final, damning piece of evidence, exposed their motive as self-preservation through fraudulent optics, confirming the malicious intent of the entire operation. The last thread of their authority snapped, resulting in 2 board member resignations and the immediate dismantling of the drilling rig, a physical concession of their guilt. The ultimate confrontation was now set. The open board meeting, where the organization would either accept accountability or execute structural collapse. The irrevocable deployment of state authority and the ensuing criminal inquiry from the CDPHE initiated the final, most devastating phase of the conflict, the complete liquidation of the HOA board's public credibility. Nancy Tilman and the remaining board conspirators were cornered, their carefully constructed cover-up protocol annihilated by my video evidence and the Tier 2 environmental breach filing. The immediate consequence of the state's intervention was the mandated open public board meeting, a forum designed not for community governance, but for terminal reckoning. The residents arrived in droves, their faces etched with confusion, fear, and a mounting, unified anger. They were not there for free wine and cheese. They were there armed with questions about their children's health, their plummeting property values, and the documented lies they had been fed for months. The board's attempt to manage this crowd was an exercise in pathetic futility. Nancy Tilman's composure was fractured. Her makeup failed to conceal the exhaustion and panic. Mark Fisher, the former vice president, sat rigid and silent, a figurehead of malignant failure. The secretary attempted to initiate the meeting with a scripted, deflection-filled update, but the crowd terminated her performance instantly. The organized rage of the community was unleashed. "What did you know about the drilling? Did you vote on this? Why didn't you notify us when the trees started dying?" The rhetorical questions escalated into direct accusations of personal liability. "My daughter got sick. Are you going to pay her medical bills? Who gave you the right to trespass on that man's land?" The conspirators attempted to control the acoustic space, but the time for administrative bluster was terminated. The sheer volume of their betrayal was drowning out their defense. The moment that solidified the board's fate was the revelation of their final, desperate act of self-preservation. Though they attempted to hold a closed, unrecorded meeting to devise their escape strategy, the internal ethical breach had spread. Someone leaked the audio of the meeting. This recording captured Nancy Tilman lamenting, "We just need to keep the optics clean until the next election." This single, lethal quote, distributed immediately across the neighborhood's communication networks, proved their malicious intent was centered entirely on self-preservation through fraudulent optics, not community safety or environmental remediation. This final, documented lie snapped the last thread of public trust. The ultimate tactical strike was deployed by my ally, James, who stood up from the second row and commanded the floor, bypassing the board's procedure. He did not engage in vocal aggression, he deployed absolute political authority. James initiated a motion to dissolve the current board under HOA Charter Article 9, a specific clause allowing residents to remove leadership if gross negligence or misconduct could be demonstrated. He was not bluffing. He presented the irrefutable evidence. The CDPHE soil analysis report, the cease and desist orders, and the video footage of their criminal actions. The vote, conducted immediately and publicly, was the final judicial reckoning. The motion passed 76 to 24. 3 board members were removed on the spot by Democratic mandate. Nancy Tilman, stripped of her title, resigned that very night, executing a retreat from the organizational structure she had corrupted and destroyed. The judicial reckoning continued as the full weight of the state's investigation was formally deployed. The CDPHE executed their warrant and secured access to the entire drilling site, followed by the DNR and county environmental enforcement. The physical evidence was overwhelming. Hazmat suits, soil core drills, and chemical testing kits confirmed the Tier 2 environmental breach. Agent Moreno confirmed their findings. The HOA's operation was illegal, unauthorized, and criminally negligent. This evidence formed the foundation of the civil complaint filed by Paul Sanderson, a lawsuit targeting Nancy Tilman, Mark Fisher, the HOA organization, and the contractors for trespass, environmental negligence, and malicious misrepresentation. The potential penalties, calculated in the 6 figures minimum, ensured that the consequences of the sulfur disaster would be uninsurable, non-negotiable, and absolutely devastating to the conspirators' financial stability. The expert retaliation phase was now fully kinetic, converting the political defeat of Nancy Tilman and the board into a total, irreversible organizational liquidation. The community's successful vote of no confidence and expulsion of the primary conspirators created a legal vacuum and a public relations nightmare that the surviving organization could not withstand. The internal collapse was immediate. 2 supplementary board members resigned under pressure, and the remaining interim board, fully exposed by the leaked audio and the Tier 2 environmental breach filing, was forced to execute a full admission of failure by dismantling the drilling rig, a physical concession of their guilt that they labeled as due to unforeseen environmental complications. This act was too little, too late, and only served to fuel the civil litigation I had strategically prepared. The civil complaint filing deployed by my attorney, Paul Sanderson, was a strategic masterpiece of overwhelming documentation. The lawsuit targeted the Oak Summit HOA organization, Nancy Tilman, individually as acting president, Mark Fisher, individually as VP, and the unnamed contractor for the full spectrum of their crimes: trespass, property damage, unlawful excavation, environmental negligence, and malicious misrepresentation. The filing was supported by a massive evidentiary dossier, including the property surveys, the irrefutable video evidence, the expert testimony from Dr. Harrow confirming the sulfur contamination, and the copies of the backdated fake HOA permits secured by Linda from the county office. The sheer volume and quality of the evidence, coupled with the state's active inquiry, ensured the filing made immediate headlines, branding the conflict as "When Suburbia Drills Too Deep, One Man's Fight Against an HOA Gone Rogue." The reputation of the Oak Summit organization, built on a fragile illusion of control and prestige, was irrevocably ruined. The new interim board, realizing the catastrophe was uninsurable and that proceeding to trial would guarantee the organization's complete financial dissolution under the weight of punitive environmental damages, initiated a desperate plea for settlement. Their offer was immediate, massive, and designed to secure silence: 6 figures for land restoration and legal fees in exchange for a non-disclosure agreement, NDA, and a gag order preventing me from discussing the terms. This was their final attempt to utilize financial assets to buy back the narrative. I refused the NDA unequivocally, prioritizing the public acknowledgement of their guilt over monetary gain. My counter-demand, transmitted through Paul, was absolute. I want acknowledgement, admission, a record that would follow every single one of them. The negotiation, now centered on ethical surrender, forced them to accept the two non-negotiable conditions for resolution: a massive financial payout and a full written public apology from the board, signed and notarized for permanent public record. The resulting $375,000 settlement was the final devastating expert retaliation. The payout was explicitly provisioned for land restoration and legal damages, validating every action I had taken. More importantly, the settlement included one final, non-negotiable clause I demanded: a statement written into the agreement that the HOA can never, under any circumstance, claim jurisdiction over my land again, not even symbolically. This permanent waiver of jurisdiction was the legal certification of my absolute sovereignty, permanently protecting McCrae Ridge from any future organized aggression. The organizational collapse followed rapidly, burdened by the financial liability, the loss of prestige, and the internal lawsuits. The Oak Summit HOA was unable to stabilize. The loss of reputation, documented fraud, and the cost of remediation sealed their fate, leading to the organization executing dissolution entirely. The very system that sought to control me was liquidated by the superior force of documented environmental law. The expert retaliation had achieved its terminal objective. The $375,000 settlement was secured, the permanent waiver of jurisdiction was signed, and the Oak Summit HOA organizational structure had executed liquidation under the weight of its own arrogance and corruption. The conflict was over, but the legacy secured was just beginning. The final settlement check cleared into a fund I created specifically for land restoration and community environmental education, appropriately designated Root Line, because if there was one undeniable lesson, it was that the real battles perpetually unfold unseen, underground, until the structural failure is absolute. This fund was the physical manifestation of accountability, designed to rebuild the ecosystem and ensure the community processed the cost of carelessness. My personal act of sovereignty began with physical manifestation. I commenced the rebuilding of the fence, not with the flimsy wire the contractors had criminally liquidated, but with massive cedar posts anchored deep in concrete, carving the final non-negotiable family seal into the gate. McCrae Ridge. This was not mere construction. It was a permanent declaration of sovereignty, a physical warning that this domain was forbidden from being pushed, tricked, or quietly trespassed. The remnants of the old pasture fencing were replaced with strategic, native windbreak rows, and I installed a solar array behind the barn and executed a trench excavation for French drains to redirect runoff away from the poisoned corner. I refused to conceal the damage. Instead, I established the contaminated section as a permanent memorial, cordoned off with warning flags and featuring a solitary bench. On a small stone plaque embedded at its feet, I carved the ultimate truth in capital letters: "Here lies what power forgets, the land remembers." The public acknowledgement was the ultimate humiliation for the former board. The settlement agreement included the full written public apology from the HOA, which the interim board was legally commanded to publish. The Oak Summit Community Bulletin ran the explicit, notarized statement: "The Oak Summit Homeowners Association formally apologizes to Mr. Dalton McCrae for the unauthorized actions taken on his property, including unpermitted drilling, environmental disturbance, and miscommunication with the community. We acknowledge the damage caused." This final permanent public record ensured that the narrative could never be fraudulently rewritten. The story was over, but the community's learning was commencing. The legacy secured was the establishment of the Root Line Education Center, an open-air classroom constructed from salvaged materials at the far end of my property. Local schools immediately initiated deployment of field trips. Students would sit under the Colorado sky, absorbing data from soil scientists and conservationists, learning about aquifer stewardship and the non-negotiable cost of unchecked power. I answered every query honestly, but the most critical transformation was personal. The neighbors, who had once feared my anger, now referred to me not as a cranky owner, but as steward, a recognition that my fight had saved their collective environment. Nancy Tilman and the former board members had achieved their total liquidation. They vanished from public life, sold their homes, and lost their licenses, their personal reputations utterly destroyed by the sulfur disaster they had unleashed. My land, though scarred, began its journey toward recovery. I worked with ecologists to introduce sulfur-tolerant plants and executed slow recovery planting. The tiny sprouts, wild sunflowers, resilient prairie grass were the visual proof that truth grows where control dies. When neighbors, including James's little girl, brought small seedlings to plant at the edge of the newly established boundary, it was a profound moment of community healing forged in shared stakes. I realized that fighting back was not merely about protecting my boundary. It was about making sure no one else had to live through what I did. The quiet I once craved had been replaced by a quiet that had been earned, a peace that possessed scars and the ability to defend itself. Justice was not always loud or headline-driven. Sometimes justice is quiet. Sometimes it grows in silence. Sometimes it is a tree reaching for the sun on land, no longer claimed by fear, but by truth.